By the spring of 1749, on the western edge of Vienna in Hietzing, the new Baroque façade of Schönbrunn Palace looked finished. A long, pale yellow front stretched along what is now Schönbrunner Schloßstraße, framed by formal parterres and the gentle rise of the Schönbrunn hill behind it. Commissioned as an imperial summer residence and reshaped under Empress Maria Theresa by court architect Nikolaus Pacassi, the once modest hunting lodge had been transformed into a 1,141-room stage for Habsburg power. Inside, the new great gallery glittered with gilt stucco, ceiling frescoes and chandeliers, its decorative program explicitly glorifying the monarch and the reforming ambitions of her reign. A dedication in court records praised the ensemble as a residence befitting the majesty of the house. Outside, stone was still settling, plaster hairline cracking in ceilings designed to last centuries. In a side wing, smaller apartments were already being assigned to the imperial children whose education Maria Theresa personally scheduled in strict daily timetables of lessons, devotions, and etiquette. The palace promised a controlled world in which heirs could be shaped as reliably as façades. From the start, Schönbrunn was conceived as both sanctuary and machine, a gilded nursery for an empire that imagined itself eternal, and a building whose beauty would outlive the fragile lives raised within its rooms. It was meant to endure. History would test how long that promise could hold. The story begins not with a palace, but with water and earth. In the early 16th century, the land that would become Schönbrunn was marshy ground along the Vienne River, a modest tributary threading through the western approaches to Vienna. Deer grazed in sparse woods. The occasional heron picked through reeds. There was no hint in those damp meadows of the architectural ambition that would one day transform them into geometry. In 1569, Emperor Maximilian II purchased the estate then known as Katerberg. Court records describe his intention plainly. He wanted a private hunting ground, fenced and stocked, where imperial parties could pursue game without traveling far from the capital. Over the following decades, the estate accumulated the infrastructure of leisure, enclosures for exotic birds, ornamental ponds, a small manor house for rest between hunts. The name Schönbrunn, meaning beautiful spring, appears in documents by the early 17th century, referencing a natural spring discovered on the grounds and later mythologized in court lore as having been found by Emperor Matthias himself during a hunting expedition. The first architectural expansion came under Dowager Empress Eleonora Gonzaga in the mid-17th century. Widowed and seeking a retreat from the formalities of the Hofburg, she commissioned a modest palace on the Katerberg site, a symmetrical two-story residence with a central hall and flanking wings, surrounded by gardens laid out in chieus. The emerging geometrical style imported from Italy and France. Contemporary engravings show a building of restrained elegance, stuccoed façades, simple pediments, rooms opening onto terraces that overlooked fish ponds and game parks. It was a palace in name, but in function, it remained what Maximilian had envisioned, a place for withdrawal, for hunting, for temporary escape from the weight of empire. Then came 1683, and the Ottoman siege of Vienna. Turkish forces encamped across the city's perimeter. The Schönbrunn estate, lying outside the fortified center, was overrun. Buildings were ransacked, gardens trampled, the modest palace left damaged and uninhabitable. When the siege lifted and Habsburg forces reclaimed the site, the imperial court faced a choice: restore what had been or imagine something greater. Ambition, as always, won. In the 1690s, Emperor Leopold I commissioned Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach, the leading Baroque architect of the age, to design a new palace at Schönbrunn. Fischer's vision, preserved in engravings published in his Entwurf einer historischen Architektur, was breathtaking in scale. A vast complex rivaling Versailles, with radiating wings, monumental courtyards, terraced gardens ascending the hill behind, and a central corps de logis that would house not merely a family, but an entire apparatus of state. The palace was to sit atop the hill itself, visible for miles, a stone declaration of Habsburg permanence rendered in colonnades and balustrades. It was never built, at least not as Fisher imagined it. The costs were prohibitive. The wars of succession drained imperial coffers. Political priorities shifted. What emerged instead was a compromise, a smaller palace lower on the site, with gardens ascending the hill in measured stages rather than supporting a hilltop citadel. Still, Fisher's plans remained in circulation, reproduced in architectural treatises and court libraries, a reminder of what Schönbrunn might have been. In those unbuilt drawings, the future was already encoded. Schönbrunn as a machine for displaying dynastic continuity, a place where architecture itself would argue for the inevitability of Habsburg rule. By the early 18th century, the partially realized palace stood as a functional if unspectacular residence. Archival inventories list rooms furnished modestly, gardens maintained but not extraordinary, a chapel for private devotions. It was used occasionally by the imperial family, more as a rural retreat than a center of power. Schönbrunn remained, in essence, what it had been under Maximilian, a hunting lodge dressed in Baroque clothes, waiting for a sovereign with the will and resources to fulfill Fischer von Erlach's deferred dream. That sovereign arrived in 1740, when Maria Theresa inherited the Habsburg domains. She was 23, untested, and within months faced a continent-wide war disputing her right to rule. The War of the Austrian Succession would consume the first years of her reign, but even amid military crisis, she was already planning. Schönbrunn, she decided, would be more than a summer retreat. It would become a symbol of resilience, of reform, of a monarchy reborn under her governance. If she could not command universal respect as a female sovereign, she would command it through the monuments she built. In 1743, with peace negotiations underway and her position gradually stabilizing, Maria Theresa ordered the transformation of Schönbrunn into a true imperial summer residence. She appointed Nikolaus Pacassi, a reliable court architect known for his skill in integrating Baroque grandeur with Rococo refinement, to oversee the remodeling. The work would span 2 decades, proceeding in phases as funds allowed, and would give Schönbrunn the form it retains today. Pacassi's commission was both aesthetic and ideological. The Empress wanted rooms that could accommodate the full ceremonial apparatus of the Habsburg court, audiences, banquets, diplomatic receptions, while also providing private apartments for her growing family. She wanted beauty, yes, but beauty in service of a message, that the House of Austria was not in decline, but in renewal. Every ceiling fresco, every gilded molding, every carefully positioned mirror would reinforce that narrative. The centerpiece of the renovation was the Great Gallery, a ceremonial hall stretching 43 meters along the garden side of the palace. Pacassi designed it as a hall of mirrors in the French manner, but inflected with Habsburg iconography. The walls were lined with tall mirrors set in gilded Rococo frames, multiplying both natural light from the garden-facing windows and the glow of chandeliers suspended from the ceiling. The ceiling itself became a canvas for imperial propaganda. The court painter, Gregorio Guglielmi, was commissioned to create 3 large frescoes glorifying Maria Theresa's reign. The central panel depicted allegories of the virtues, justice, prudence, fortitude, surrounding the Empress herself, while flanking panels illustrated the prosperity of the Habsburg crown lands and the benefits of her administrative reforms. The iconographic program was explicit. This was not merely decoration, it was argument rendered in paint and plaster. Every figure in those frescoes, every emblematic gesture, reinforced a single claim: that Maria Theresa's rule was divinely sanctioned, rationally governed, and materially beneficial to her subjects. Visitors entering the Great Gallery, foreign ambassadors, German princes, potential spouses for Habsburg children, would stand beneath those ceilings and absorb the message whether they consciously recognized it or not. Architecture, in this sense, functioned as a form of soft power, shaping perceptions through beauty and scale. The chandeliers deserve particular attention. Cast in the Rococo style, then fashionable across Europe, they combined gilded metal frames with cascades of cut crystal, designed to catch and refract light from candles mounted at multiple tiers. Each chandelier held dozens of candles. On ceremonial occasions, with all fixtures lit, The great gallery would blaze with a light that seemed almost supernatural. Contemporary accounts describe the effect as overwhelming. Guests reported feeling dazzled, disoriented by the interplay of candlelight, mirrors, and gilding. This was intentional. The chandeliers were instruments of power, using physics and artistry to create an atmosphere in which the Habsburg court appeared not merely wealthy but transcendent. Elsewhere in the palace, Pacassi created spaces of more intimate splendor. The Chinese cabinets, a pair of small rooms decorated in the fashionable chinoiserie style, were lined with lacquered panels and porcelain imported from East Asia, their walls a riot of exotic birds, flowering branches, and pagoda silhouettes. In one of these rooms, Pacassi installed a mechanical marvel, a table de conspiration, a table that could be lowered through the floor to the kitchen below, set with food and wine, then raised back into the room, allowing the Empress and her closest advisors to dine without servants present. The mechanism, documented in the diary of Prince Johann Josef Khevenhüller-Metsch, was both practical and symbolic, a space where confidential discussions could occur in perfect privacy, insulated from the ears of courtiers and spies. The work proceeded slowly. Masons laid new floors, plasterers sculpted rococo ornament on ceilings and walls, painters applied layer after layer of pigment, building up the luminous surfaces that would define the palace's interior atmosphere. By the late 1750s, the staterooms were largely complete. By the early 1760s, attention shifted to the private apartments and service wings. Throughout, Maria Theresa remained closely involved, reviewing plans, approving expenses, insisting on changes. She understood that Schönbrunn was not merely a residence but a legacy, a building that would outlive her, representing her reign to future generations. The gardens, too, were reshaped. The great parterre, a vast formal garden stretching from the palace façade toward the hill behind, was laid out in the French manner by Jean Tréhay, combining geometrical flower beds with trimmed hedges, gravel paths, and fountains. At the crest of the hill, the gloriette, a triumphal archway framing a colonnade, was erected in 1775 to commemorate Habsburg military victories. From the palace windows, the view was carefully composed, flower beds in the foreground, the parterre extending toward the hill, and the gloriette crowning the composition, a stone exclamation point asserting Habsburg dominance over the landscape. What emerges from the architectural record is a vision of total control. Schönbrunn was not a place where nature interrupted architecture or where spontaneity was welcome. Every sightline had been calculated, every room had a designated function. Every ornamental detail reinforced the larger program. It was a stage set, designed for the performance of monarchy and for the manufacture of future monarchs who would internalize its lessons from childhood onward. By 1765, the remodeling was substantially complete. The palace had become what Maria Theresa intended, a Baroque machine for displaying and perpetuating Habsburg power, a place where architecture, art, and ceremony combined to create an image of permanence. The Empress moved her court to Schönbrunn every summer, hosting diplomatic audiences, family gatherings, and court festivities within its walls. The Great Gallery hosted balls where future alliances were negotiated through dance. The gardens hosted promenades where courtiers jockeyed for favor. The private apartments hosted the daily routines of imperial family life. Meals, lessons, prayers, all conducted according to schedules as rigid as the palace's geometry. And everywhere, the chandeliers hung, glittering above it all. Maria Theresa bore 16 children between 1737 and 1756. 13 survived infancy, a statistically favorable outcome for the 18th century, but one that reflected both medical attention and maternal vigilance. She was determined that her children, especially her daughters, would be prepared for the political marriages that were the currency of dynastic diplomacy. This required education, not merely literacy and religious instruction, but training in deportment, languages, statecraft, and the performance of monarchy itself. For the Empress, education was inseparable from architecture. Children learned not just through books and tutors, but through the spaces they inhabited. At Schönbrunn, the layout of rooms, the rituals of movement, the routines of daily life, All were designed to inscribe lessons about hierarchy, duty, and control. The palace functioned as a pedagogical machine, shaping bodies and minds through repetition and spatial discipline. The children's apartments were located in a side wing of the palace, interconnected suites that allowed supervision while maintaining some degree of separation from the ceremonial staterooms. Surviving floor plans show a sequence of chambers, bedrooms, dressing rooms, small salons for lessons, and antechambers where servants waited. The rooms were furnished with child-sized furniture, miniature chairs, scaled-down writing desks, but the decor followed adult models. Even in nursery spaces, the walls bore allegorical frescoes. The ceilings featured plasterwork in the Rococo style. There was no distinct visual language of childhood. From the earliest age, Habsburg children inhabited spaces designed to remind them of their place in a larger hierarchical order. Maria Theresa personally designed the educational schedules. Surviving documents in the Haus-, Hof- and Staatsarchiv in Vienna detail the daily routines. Children rose at specified hours, attended morning devotions in the palace chapel, then proceeded to lessons in languages, history, music, dance, and religion. Afternoons included physical exercise, walks in the gardens, riding lessons, or supervised play in designated areas, but always within a framework of control. Evenings brought more lessons, then supper, then prayers before bed. There was little room for spontaneity. Every hour had a purpose. Languages were particularly emphasized. Habsburg children were expected to speak German, French, Italian, and Latin fluently, with additional instruction in the languages of territories they might one day govern: Czech, Hungarian, Polish. Tutors were carefully selected for their linguistic expertise and political reliability. Lessons took place in designated rooms where children sat at desks while instructors stood, maintaining spatial hierarchies even in pedagogy. Religious instruction was equally rigorous. Maria Theresa was a devout Catholic, and she insisted her children internalize the faith as both personal conviction and political identity. The Habsburg claim to imperial leadership in Central Europe rested partly on the dynasty's role as defender of Catholicism. For her children to be effective rulers, they needed to embody that identity convincingly. Daily Mass was mandatory. Confessor priests monitored the children's spiritual development and reported directly to the Empress. Dance and deportment were taught with military precision. Habsburg children learned not merely how to dance, but how to move through space in ways that communicated rank and authority. Bowing, curtsying, entering and exiting rooms, ascending and descending stairs. Each had specific protocols. Children practiced in the palace corridors, walking from their apartments to the Great Gallery, learning to navigate the long enfilades with the correct posture and pace. Every threshold was a lesson: who entered first, who yielded space, whose presence commanded deference. The case of Maria Carolina, one of Maria Theresa's younger daughters, illustrates the system's intensity. Born in 1752, she was destined from early childhood for a political marriage, eventually to Ferdinand IV of Naples, though that was not yet determined. Her education, documented in letters and court records, included French, Italian, history, music, drawing, and dance. She was taught to play the harpsichord, to embroider, to converse intelligently on topics ranging from theology to literature. But beyond these skills, she was taught something harder to quantify: how to perform monarchy. How to sit in a chair as if it were a throne, how to modulate her voice to convey authority without aggression, how to read a room and adjust her demeanor accordingly. Maria Theresa's letters to her daughters, preserved in archives across Europe, reveal a mother who was affectionate but uncompromising. She praised obedience and criticized deviation. She reminded her daughters constantly that their personal desires were secondary to dynastic needs, that marriage was a political instrument, that their duty was to secure alliances and produce heirs. Love, if it came, was incidental. The letters are tender and ruthless in equal measure, expressions of maternal care framed entirely within the logic of statecraft. At Schönbrunn, this ideology was embedded in the physical environment. The children's apartments opened onto corridors that led, eventually, to the Great Gallery. As they walked those corridors, they passed portraits of ancestors, allegorical paintings of Habsburg virtues, mirrors that reflected their own images back in endless repetition. The architecture taught them that they were not individuals but continuations, links in a dynastic chain stretching backward to Charlemagne and forward, theoretically, forever. The gardens reinforced these lessons in a different key. The formal parterres, with their geometrical precision, demonstrated the triumph of order over nature. Children were allowed to play in designated areas, but they were not allowed to stray from paths or disturb flower beds. Even recreation was structured, a controlled release within boundaries set by adult authority. The message was clear. Freedom existed only within frameworks established by power. There were occasional moments of resistance. Letters and memoirs hinted children who chafed under the regime, younger sons resentful of their marginalization, daughters who questioned their arranged marriages. But such resistance was largely futile. The system was too comprehensive, too embedded in the routines of daily life. At Schönbrunn, architecture and ideology were fused so thoroughly that to rebel against one was to rebel against both. By adolescence, Habsburg children had been so thoroughly shaped by this environment that separation from it was disorienting. When daughters left for foreign courts, Maria Carolina to Naples, Maria Antonia, later Marie Antoinette to France, they carried Schönbrunn with them, internalizing its lessons even as they adapted to new palaces and new rituals. The nursery had done its work. In photographs preserved at the palace today, visitors can see reconstructed children's rooms in the West Tract, part of the modern Kindermuseum Schönbrunn. Replica furniture, period toys, interpretive labels describing daily routines, all attempt to evoke what childhood was like in this gilded environment. But the exhibits, by their nature, sanitize. They present childhood as a curiosity, a historical artifact to be admired from behind glass. They cannot convey the weight of expectation, the relentlessness of supervision, the psychological cost of being raised not as a person, but as a project. In these rooms, childhood was not an age but a curriculum. The goal was not happiness but functionality, to produce heirs who could perform monarchy competently, who would marry strategically, who would understand that their lives belonged not to themselves, but to the dynasty and the state. Schönbrunn, the palace that Maria Theresa had built to glorify her reign, childhood was transformed into a form of production, the manufacture of emperors. By the turn of the 19th century, Schönbrunn had become more than a summer residence. It was a symbol, instantly recognizable across Europe as the heart of Habsburg family life and the nursery of the dynasty's future. The palace had weathered the Napoleonic Wars, occupied twice by French forces in 1805 and 1809, its rooms briefly commandeered for enemy headquarters, but it had survived. Habsburg continuity, the palace seemed to argue, was stronger than any individual defeat. On August 18, 1830, in the east wing of Schönbrunn, Archduchess Sophie gave birth to a son. He was named Franz Joseph after his grandfather, the reigning Emperor Franz I. The birth took place in modest apartments, modest by comparison with the staterooms at least, furnished in the Biedermeier style, then fashionable among the Viennese bourgeoisie. Plain wallpaper, simple furniture, a cradle of polished wood. The infant Archduke's first environment was understated, a reminder that even within the Habsburg family, not all children were destined for thrones. Yet Franz Joseph's birth location mattered. He entered the world within the walls of Schönbrunn, in rooms that had for decades housed imperial children, in a palace whose every corridor and staircase encoded lessons about power and continuity. From his first breath, he inhabited a space designed to shape him. His early childhood followed patterns established by Maria Theresa generations before. Franz Joseph and his siblings spent summers at Schönbrunn, winters at the Hofburg in Vienna, moving between palaces according to a calendar that structured Habsburg family life with the regularity of a liturgical calendar. At Schönbrunn, the children occupied the same apartments that had housed earlier generations, sleeping in rooms where their great-aunts and great-uncles had learned to bow and curtsy, playing in gardens where their ancestors had walked in formation. The child's governess was Louise von Sturmfeder, a woman of lower nobility whose title, Baroness, gave her just enough status to serve the imperial family while ensuring she would never forget her subordinate position. Known affectionately to the children as Aja, she supervised Franz Joseph and his younger brothers with a combination of tenderness and discipline. Her memoirs, written decades later, describe the daily routines: early rising, prayers, simple breakfasts, lessons in reading and basic arithmetic, walks in the gardens under supervision, and always the rituals of greeting and deference. Sturmfeder's account reveals a poignant tension. She clearly loved the children in her care, describing their personalities with warmth and detail. Franz Joseph she remembered as serious, diligent, eager to please. His brother Maximilian was more imaginative, prone to daydreaming, less inclined toward the strict obedience the court demanded, but Sturmfeder also knew her role was temporary. Habsburg protocol required that at age 6, children be transferred from the care of governesses to formal tutors, a transition called Staatserziehung, state education. After that transition, the children were forbidden from using familiar forms of address with their former caregivers. Aja became Baroness von Sturmfeder. The affectionate bond was severed by decree. For Franz Joseph, that transition came in 1836. He was moved from the nursery apartments to rooms designated for formal education, and his curriculum intensified. Tutors were appointed for German, French, Hungarian, Czech, Latin, history, geography, mathematics, and military science. Physical training included riding, fencing, and drill. Religious instruction continued daily, with emphasis on the Habsburg role as defenders of Catholicism. The child's day was scheduled to the quarter hour, with little allowance for rest or spontaneous play. The architecture of Schönbrunn facilitated this intensification. The child's route from his sleeping quarters to his classrooms took him through corridors lined with ancestral portraits, past doorways opening onto the great gallery, and down staircases where servants stood at attention. Every journey reinforced hierarchy. Every movement was observed. The palace functioned as a panopticon, not through surveillance devices, but through its spatial logic. Long sightlines, interconnected rooms, and the constant presence of attendants who reported to higher authorities. One detail from this period stands out in the archives: the chandeliers. Franz Joseph's memoirs, written late in life, mention his childhood fascination with the great gallery's chandeliers. He remembered being led past the gallery's open doors on his way to lessons, catching glimpses of the vast hall with its glittering fixtures suspended from the ceiling. On rare occasions, state receptions, family celebrations, the children were allowed into the gallery itself, and Franz Joseph recalled the overwhelming effect of standing beneath those chandeliers when they were fully lit, hundreds of candles blazing, the light multiplied by mirrors until the room seemed to dissolve into pure radiance. For a child, such moments must have felt magical. But they were also lessons. The chandeliers taught scale, taught grandeur, taught that the Habsburgs commanded resources beyond ordinary comprehension. They taught that to be Habsburg was to live in a world where even light was a form of power. The young Archduke absorbed these lessons thoroughly. By adolescence, Franz Joseph had become what the system intended: obedient, dutiful, trained to prioritize state responsibilities over personal desire. He spoke multiple languages fluently, understood court protocol instinctively, and moved through Schönbrunn spaces with the ease of someone who had internalized its geometry. He was, in every sense, a product of the palace. In 1848, revolution swept across Europe. In Vienna, demonstrations forced Emperor Ferdinand III, Franz Joseph's uncle, to abdicate. The Habsburgs needed a new emperor, one untainted by the Ancien Regime's failures, but still young enough to symbolize renewal. Franz Joseph, 18 years old, was chosen. On December 2, 1848, he became Emperor of Austria. The boy who had been raised at Schönbrunn, whose childhood had been structured by its rooms and routines, now ruled the empire that palace had been built to sustain. And for the next 68 years, until his death in 1916, Franz Joseph would return to Schönbrunn every summer, occupying the same apartments where he had been born, walking the same corridors where he had learned to bow, sleeping beneath ceilings that had framed his earliest memories. The palace that had manufactured him as an emperor would remain his favorite residence, a place of comfort, perhaps, but also a monument to the system that had shaped him so completely that he could never fully escape it. The education of Habsburg archdukes combined the Enlightenment ideal of cultivated intelligence with a militaristic emphasis on obedience and discipline. Franz Joseph's formal curriculum, once he entered Staatserziehung, reflected this duality. His tutors included scholars, military officers, and clergy, each responsible for specific domains of knowledge and character formation. Count Heinrich Bombels served as the young Archduke's ajo, the male equivalent of a governess, overseeing his moral and general education. Bombel, a loyal court figure with connections to the conservative aristocracy, emphasized duty, piety, and the subordination of personal will to dynastic necessity. He assigned readings in history and political philosophy designed to instill reverence for Habsburg tradition and suspicion of revolutionary ideals. Lessons took place in designated rooms at Schönbrunn, spaces furnished with maps, globes, and shelves of leather-bound volumes. The atmosphere was monastic, quiet, disciplined, focused entirely on the task of shaping an imperial mind. Military training intensified as Franz Joseph approached adolescence. Colonel Franz von Hauslab, a career officer, drilled the Archduke in tactics, fortification, and the command structures of the Austrian army. Lessons alternated between classroom instruction and practical exercises in the Schönbrunn gardens, where miniature fortifications had been constructed decades earlier for precisely this purpose. Franz Joseph learned to read battlefield maps, to calculate artillery trajectories, to issue orders with the curt authority expected of Habsburg commanders. He wore military uniforms during these lessons, tailored versions of the infantry dress code, and was taught to regard the army as both instrument and extension of imperial will. Language instruction was relentless. The Austrian Empire encompassed German-speaking provinces, Hungarian lands, Czech and Slovak regions, Polish territories, and Italian holdings. To govern effectively, a Habsburg emperor needed linguistic fluency across this diversity. Franz Joseph's tutors drilled him in conversational German, High German for official proclamations, French for diplomacy, Hungarian for political negotiation, Czech for ceremonial appearances, and Italian for communication with Lombard and Venetian subjects. Latin remained essential for religious contexts and for reading historical documents. Lessons unfolded in strict temporal order. Mornings began with languages and history, afternoons shifted to military science and mathematics, evenings included music and drawing, considered necessary accomplishments for a cultivated monarch. Throughout, tutors emphasized punctuality and precision. Franz Joseph learned to manage time with the same discipline he applied to languages and tactics. Every hour had its assignment, every task had its deadline. The goal was to produce an emperor who functioned like a well-regulated clock, predictable, efficient, incapable of deviation. Religious instruction formed the ethical core of this curriculum. Father Joseph Othmar von Rauscher, a conservative priest who would later become Archbishop of Vienna, served as Franz Joseph's confessor and religious tutor. Rauscher taught catechism, liturgical history, and Catholic moral theology, emphasizing the divine sanction of Habsburg rule. The empire, in Rauscher's framework, was not merely a political entity, but a sacred trust. The Habsburgs ruled by God's will, and to serve the dynasty was to serve Providence itself. Franz Joseph attended Mass daily in the Schönbrunn Chapel, a small Baroque space with an altarpiece depicting the Holy Family, a not-so-subtle equation of Habsburg family life with sacred order. The architecture of Schönbrunn reinforced these pedagogical methods. Lessons took place in rooms with high ceilings and large windows, spaces designed to make students feel simultaneously supported and scrutinized. The polished parquet floors recorded every footstep. The tall mirrors reflected every posture. Tutors could observe not just what the young Archduke said, but how he held himself, how he moved, whether his body language communicated authority or uncertainty. The transition from classroom to public space was deliberate. After lessons, Franz Joseph was sometimes required to walk through the Great Gallery, practicing the stride and bearing appropriate for ceremonial occasions. Palace attendants stood at intervals, silently observing, ready to correct any deviation from protocol. The The child learned that his body was never wholly his own. It belonged to the role he would one day perform. The Great Gallery, with its chandeliers hanging overhead, functioned as both rehearsal space and symbol, a reminder that monarchy was a performance requiring constant practice. Franz Joseph's younger brother, Maximilian, received a similar education but experienced it differently. Maximilian's tutors noted his imaginative temperament, his love of literature and natural history, his tendency toward introspection. Where Franz Joseph accepted discipline without visible resistance, Maximilian questioned, wondered, occasionally resented. Letters preserved in the Haus-, Hof- and Staatsarchive record Maximilian's requests for books on subjects outside the official curriculum: travel narratives, botanical treatises, philosophical texts that hinted at Enlightenment skepticism. The system had little room for such intellectual independence. Habsburg education aimed to produce functional rulers, not philosophers. Maximilian's tutors discouraged his more speculative interests, redirecting him toward practical studies. Yet the differences between the brothers persisted. Franz Joseph internalized Schönbrunn's lessons completely, becoming a model of imperial discipline. Maximilian remained ambivalent, absorbing the training but retaining a part of himself that resisted complete absorption into the Habsburg role. The contrast would prove consequential. In 1864, Maximilian accepted an offer to become Emperor of Mexico, a doomed venture orchestrated by Napoleon III of France and conservative Mexican factions. Maximilian's brief reign ended in 1867 when Republican forces captured and executed him. His death was a tragedy born partly from his inability to fully inhabit the Habsburg model. He was too idealistic, too willing to imagine alternatives, too shaped by the contradictions in his Schönbrunn education, trained for authority but exposed just enough to intellectual currents that questioned its foundations. Franz Joseph, by contrast, never wavered. He became the emperor Schönbrunn had designed him to be: diligent, conservative, resistant to change, committed to the preservation of Habsburg power regardless of political cost. He worked at his desk for hours every day, reviewing documents, signing decrees, maintaining the bureaucratic rhythms that kept the empire functioning. He dressed in military uniform even on ordinary days, embodying the militaristic discipline that had structured his childhood. He attended court ceremonies with the same punctuality he brought to everything else, performing monarchy with the precision of a well-rehearsed actor. In later memoirs, courtiers who knew Franz Joseph described a man incapable of spontaneity, a ruler who approached even leisure with methodical seriousness. His personality had been so thoroughly formed by the routines of Schönbrunn that deviation felt impossible. The palace had not merely taught him monarchy, it had inscribed monarchy into the structures of his consciousness, making him indistinguishable from the role he performed. At Schönbrunn, under the gilded ceilings and within the geometry of its corridors, childhood was not about discovery, but about discipline. The lessons were relentless: how to walk, how to speak, how to subordinate personal desire to dynastic necessity. And, in the case of Franz Joseph, those lessons succeeded so completely that the man and the emperor became inseparable, two aspects of a single identity manufactured by the palace that raised him. The gardens at Schönbrunn extended over 1.2 square kilometers, a vast landscape of cultivated nature designed to serve the dual functions of beauty and pedagogy. Beyond the formal parterres with their geometrical flower beds lay other spaces: wooded groves, hedge labyrinths, ornamental fountains, and, most significant for Habsburg children, the Meidlinger Vertiefung. The Meidlinger Vertiefung, or Meidling Depression, occupied a natural low point in the park's western section. In the 18th century, landscape architects had transformed this topographical feature into a sunken garden with gently sloping sides and a flat central area. By the 19th century, under Franz Joseph's childhood, the Vertiefung had acquired a new purpose. It became a training ground for imperial children, a place where games and military drills intersected. Court records describe the installation of miniature fortifications in the Vertiefung: earthwork berms, small trenches, wooden palisades, designed to mimic real battlefield defenses at child scale. Habsburg princes, dressed in scaled-down military uniforms, conducted mock sieges and tactical exercises under the supervision of junior officers assigned to their education. The games taught basic military concepts, flanking maneuvers, defensive positions, the coordination of infantry movements, but they also taught something more fundamental: that war was normal, that violence was a form of play, that the boys' bodies were being prepared for futures as commanders of armies. A garden pavilion stood at the edge of the Vertifung, a small Baroque structure where the imperial family could observe the children's exercises. The pavilion's interior was modest, a few chairs, a table, windows overlooking the sunken ground, but its symbolic function was clear. The children performed not in isolation, but under observation, their movements watched and judged by the adults who would determine their futures. The architecture encoded surveillance as a feature of imperial upbringing. For Franz Josef, the Meidlinger Vertiefung would have been a familiar space, a place where physical training alternated with the intellectual drills of the classroom. But it was his son, Crown Prince Rudolf, born in 1858, whose childhood in these gardens would become notorious and tragic. Rudolf's early education followed established patterns: governesses for his first years, then formal tutors, with an emphasis on languages, history, and military science. But in 1865, when Rudolf was 7, Emperor Franz Joseph appointed Count Leopold Gondrecourt as the child's primary military instructor. Gondrecourt, a career officer shaped by the Austrian army's conservative culture, believed that princes required harsh conditioning to become effective leaders. Gondrecourt's methods went beyond the mock battles of the Vertifung. He subjected Rudolf to night drills, waking the child unexpectedly and forcing him to march through darkened corridors and gardens. He ordered subordinates to fire pistols near the boy to desensitize him to gunfire. He enforced a regime of cold baths, physical punishment for perceived weakness, and relentless criticism. The goal, in Gondrecourt's view, was to eliminate fear and sentimentality, producing a crown prince capable of commanding armies without hesitation or emotional distraction. Rudolf, however, was not Franz Joseph. The child was intellectually curious, sensitive, prone to introspection. The harsh regimen left him fearful rather than hardened. Servants reported that the crown prince suffered nightmares, bedwetting, and episodes of acute anxiety. He became withdrawn, reluctant to speak in the presence of adults, visibly tense during military exercises. Rudolf's mother, Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi, noticed the damage. Unlike her husband, whose own harsh education had made him accepting of similar methods for his son, Elizabeth recognized that Gondrecourt's regimen was traumatizing the child. In 1865, she wrote a letter to Franz Joseph demanding unumschränkte Vollmacht in allem, was die Kinder betrifft, unlimited authority in all matters concerning the children. The letter, preserved in the Haus-, Hof- und Staatsarchiv, is a remarkable document, a rare instance of an empress challenging imperial authority on pedagogical grounds. Franz Joseph acquiesced. Gondrecourt was dismissed. A more moderate tutor, Colonel Joseph Latour von Thurmberg, replaced him. But the psychological damage had been done. Rudolf grew into an intellectually gifted but emotionally unstable adult, a crown prince torn between his duties and his resentments, between the world he was trained to lead and his growing conviction that the Habsburg system was obsolete. The Meidlinger Vertiefung, where Rudolf had drilled as a boy, became in retrospect a symbol of the violence embedded in Habsburg child-rearing, not the overt violence of war, but the structural violence of a system that treated children as instruments rather than persons, that subordinated developmental needs to dynastic imperatives. Today, the garden pavilion that once overlooked those childhood drills serves as a cafe. Visitors order coffee and pastries, sitting at tables where Habsburg adults once sat, watching princes rehearse obedience. The earthworks have been removed. The Vertiefung is now a sunken lawn where families picnic and children play freely, unaware of the regimented games that once filled the space. The transformation is complete. The drill ground has become a commons, and the militaristic pedagogy of the past exists only in archival records and historical interpretations. But in the decades when Rudolf was raised, decades when Franz Joseph's own childhood model was replicated with intensified militarism, the gardens at Schönbrunn were not neutral landscapes. They were extensions of the palace's pedagogical machine, open-air classrooms where bodies were drilled, wills were tested, and the costs of imperial ambition were written into the psyches of children who had no choice but to absorb them. The great parterre, with its geometrical precision, demonstrated control over nature. The Meidlinger Vertiefung, with its miniature fortifications, demonstrated control over childhood. Together, they formed a single system, an environment where every element, stone, water, earth, even the movement of small bodies across grass, was organized to serve the dynasty's vision of continuity. The chandeliers in the great gallery glittered above state receptions. The earthworks in the Vertiefung waited for princes in uniform, and between these poles, between ceremonial grandeur and militarized play, the palace manufactured the heirs who would, it was assumed, perpetuate Habsburg rule into an indefinite future. The assumption, of course, would prove wrong. Among the collections preserved at Schönbrunn today is the Wagenburg, the imperial carriage museum housed in a former winter riding school on the palace grounds. The museum displays over 60 vehicles used by the Habsburg family across 3 centuries: coronation carriages, state coaches, hunting wagons, and hearses. Among these objects are several miniature carriages designed for children. One such carriage, catalogued as belonging to Crown Prince Rudolf, is a small, 4-wheeled vehicle upholstered in velvet and fitted with brass lamps. Its scale is perfectly calibrated for a child, yet its design replicates adult ceremonial vehicles in every detail: gilded trim, coats of arms painted on the doors, glass windows with silk curtains. The message encoded in such an object is unambiguous. Even in childhood, Habsburg princes were preparing for lives conducted in public view, lives where every movement would be staged and observed. The carriages were not toys, they were training instruments, part of a larger system for teaching imperial children how to inhabit public roles. Habsburg protocol required elaborate rituals of arrival and departure. When the imperial family traveled, even short distances within Vienna, the order of carriages, the timing of arrivals, the sequence of exits, all were minutely choreographed. Children learned these rituals through repetition, practicing in their miniature vehicles till the movements became instinctive. At Schönbrunn, the palace's spatial organization facilitated this training. The main courtyard, facing the city, served as a staging area for arrivals and departures. Carriages would pull up to the entrance, footmen would open doors, family members would descend in hierarchical order, with the emperor or empress exiting first, followed by archdukes and archduchesses according to age and rank. Children stood in line, waiting their turn, learning to time their movements precisely. Inside the palace, comparable rituals governed everyday circulation. The enfilade of staterooms, a sequence of interconnected chambers that could be crossed by opening a series of doors, was the standard architectural feature of Baroque palaces, designed to create impressive vistas and to control access. At Schönbrunn, the enfilade stretched from the east wing through the Great Gallery to the west wing, a linear sequence that reinforced social hierarchy with every step. When children moved through these spaces, they did not walk casually. They were taught to enter rooms at specific angles, to pause at thresholds, to modulate their pace according to the room's function and the company present. Court ceremonial manuals preserved in the Austrian state archives detail these protocols with exhaustive precision. For instance, when entering a room where senior family members were present, a child was to pause, bow, or curtsy, wait to be acknowledged, then proceed to an assigned position. Failure to observe these formalities was corrected immediately, not through overt punishment necessarily, but through subtle disapproval, through the withdrawal of favor, through the withholding of privileges that made court life bearable. The palace architecture made such discipline visible and inevitable. Long enfilades eliminated ambiguity about direction. Mirrors reflected every gesture. Polished floors recorded every misstep. In this environment, spontaneity was effectively impossible. Movement itself became a performance, rehearsed daily until the protocols were internalized and the body moved correctly without conscious thought. For Habsburg children, this extended beyond palace interiors. Public appearances required similar discipline. When the imperial family attended church, opera, or state ceremonies, Children rode in carriages fitted with small seats and instructed to sit motionless, hands folded, faces composed. The carriages had windows. Crowds outside could see inside. Every moment of visibility was a moment of performance, and children understood from early age that they were always being watched. Archival photographs from the late 19th century show Habsburg children posed in formal settings, standing beside carriages arranged on palace steps, seated in rigid configurations. Their expressions are often solemn, their postures stiff. Modern viewers sometimes interpret this as photographic convention. Long exposure times required stillness. But the deeper truth is that these children had been trained in stillness, schooled in the suppression of fidgeting, taught that their bodies were public property subject to constant scrutiny. The Wagenburgs collection includes a children's hearse, a small funerary vehicle designed for the rare but not unprecedented occasions when imperial children died before adulthood. The object is startling. Black lacquer, silver trim, glass panels revealing a tiny coffin compartment. Even death for Habsburg children was ceremonial, conducted with the same meticulous attention to protocol that governed every other aspect of their lives. The connection between these vehicles and the palace's interior architecture is direct. Both systems, carriages and corridors, were technologies for managing visibility, for ensuring that imperial bodies moved through space in ways that communicated authority and legitimacy. The goal was to eliminate the gap between person and symbol, to make the heir identical with the role, so that when the time came for coronation or succession, there would be no discontinuity, no awkwardness, only the smooth transfer of power from one carefully prepared body to the next. This system worked to the extent that it produced rulers capable of performing their roles without visible hesitation. Franz Joseph, trained from birth in these protocols, moved through state ceremonies with mechanical precision, his gestures calibrated, his timing flawless. But it also created psychological costs rarely documented in official records. The memoirs of courtiers and family members hint at these costs: rigid personalities, inability to relax, chronic anxiety about protocol violations, and a pervasive sense that personal identity was inseparable from public role. At Schönbrunn, the manufacture of emperors required not just intellectual training or moral instruction, but the thorough disciplining of bodies in space. Carriages, corridors, thresholds, mirrors, all were tools in this process, working together to produce subjects who understood that their movements, like their thoughts and ambitions, belonged not to themselves, but to the dynasty they served. When modern visitors tour the Wagenburg, they see beautiful objects: gilded coaches, ornate sleighs, the craftsmanship of Viennese artisans. But beneath the aesthetic surface lies a system of control as comprehensive as any devised in the name of power. These vehicles did not simply transport children, they formed them, teaching lessons in visibility, performance, and the relentless demands of being Habsburg. By the late 19th century, Schönbrunn bore the weight of time. Surfaces that had gleamed under Maria Theresa now showed cracks, stucco required patching, paint faded despite repeated restorations. In 1891, conservators undertook a comprehensive survey of the palace's condition, producing reports that documented water damage, structural settling, and the need for modern utilities. The building endured, but maintaining its magnificence required constant intervention. In 1898, the palace administration installed electric lighting in the Great Gallery and other ceremonial spaces. Hundreds of light bulbs were wired into the 18th century chandeliers, replacing candles while attempting to preserve the visual effect of candlelight. Photographs from the installation show workers on scaffolding, threading wires through gilded metal frames, retrofitting Rococo artistry with industrial-age technology. The chandeliers, once symbols of enlightened absolutism, became hybrids, historical objects adapted for modern functionality, their aesthetic continuity maintained even as their material reality transformed. The electrification was both practical and symbolic. It allowed the palace to function in a new century, hosting state receptions and diplomatic events with reliable illumination. But it also represented an acknowledgement that the past could not be preserved unchanged. Continuity required adaptation. The chandeliers now glowed with a steadier, less atmospheric light, efficient, predictable, and subtly wrong. Contemporaries noted the difference. Electric light lacked the flicker and warmth of candlelight, the slight variations in brightness that had given the great gallery its magical quality. The room was brighter, but something had been lost. The chandelier's transformation paralleled larger transformations in the Habsburg dynasty. The empire that Schönbrunn had been built to sustain was fracturing along national, linguistic, and ideological lines. Hungarian demands for autonomy had led to the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, creating a dual monarchy that acknowledged the empire's internal divisions. Czech, Polish, and South Slav populations pressed for greater recognition. Industrialization and urbanization eroded traditional social hierarchies. The political and cultural consensus that had supported dynastic rule was eroding. And then came January 30th, 1889. At Meierling, a hunting lodge south of Vienna, Crown Prince Rudolf died under circumstances that remain contested. Official reports called it a suicide pact with his mistress, Baroness Maria Theresa. Alternative theories suggested murder or political assassination. Regardless of the precise cause, the result was catastrophic for the dynasty. The heir to the throne was dead at age 30, leaving no legitimate son, and Franz Joseph suddenly faced a succession crisis. Rudolf's death did not occur at Schönbrunn, but its reverberations filled the palace. Court mourning protocols required the closing of state rooms, the draping of mirrors, the suspension of ceremonies. The great gallery, where Rudolf had attended balls and receptions, stood empty, its chandeliers dark. The gardens where he had drilled as a child became spaces of collective grief, visited by courtiers processing their shock. For a palace designed as a nursery of continuity, Rudolf's death was a failure of the first order. The system had raised him, trained him, shaped him according to the Habsburg model. And yet he had become a deeply unhappy adult, politically disaffected, personally unstable, unable or unwilling to fulfill the role for which he had been so meticulously prepared. His death marked the moment when the machinery of Schönbrunn's pedagogy revealed its limits. You could manufacture an emperor's body, but you could not guarantee the emperor's will to live. The succession passed to Franz Josef's younger brother, Archduke Karl Ludwig, and after Karl Ludwig's death in 1896, to Karl Ludwig's son, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But Franz Ferdinand, unlike Franz Josef, had not been raised from birth as a future emperor. He lacked the total immersion in Schönbrunn's routines. His personality was more independent, his political views more reformist. The line of succession had fractured, and with it, the seamless continuity the palace had been designed to guarantee. In the years following Rudolf's death, Franz Josef continued to spend summers at Schönbrunn, maintaining his routines with the same discipline he had practiced since childhood. He worked at his desk in the private apartments, attended Mass in the chapel, walked the gardens in the early morning. But the palace had changed. It was no longer a place where the future was being prepared. It had become a monument to the past, a stage for an aging emperor's habitual performances. Conservation efforts continued. In 1901, restorers repainted the Great Gallery's ceiling frescoes, carefully matching Guglielmi's original pigments. In 1905, the parquet floors in the staterooms were refinished. The palace required constant maintenance to sustain its image of permanence, but the effort felt increasingly defensive. The building was being preserved not as a living center of power, but as an artifact, a beautiful relic of an order that was visibly failing. The chandeliers still hung in the great gallery, their electric bulbs glowing steadily, but the light they cast was ambiguous. Was it the radiance of imperial continuity or the artificial glow of a dynasty on life support? Visitors could interpret the scene either way, and increasingly they chose the latter. By the early 20th century, Schönbrunn had become something it was never meant to be. A symbol of fragility rather than strength, a palace that had outlasted the certainties that built it. The plaster could be patched, the bulbs replaced, the surfaces maintained, but beneath the restored façades, the structural logic that had once justified the building's existence was crumbling. The nursery had failed at its most essential task, ensuring the dynasty's continuity. Rudolph's death had shattered the illusion that architecture and education could guarantee political stability. The future was no longer a product to be manufactured in gilded rooms. It was an unpredictable force that no amount of discipline or ceremony could control. On November 21, 1916, Emperor Franz Joseph died in his private apartments at Schönbrunn. He was 86 years old and had reigned for 68 years, one of the longest reigns in European history. The official death certificate lists the location as Schönbrunn Palace. The cause is pneumonia complicated by advanced age. He died in the same building where he had been born 86 years earlier, in rooms he had occupied every summer for nearly 9 decades. The circularity was exact. From cradle to deathbed within the same walls, a life framed entirely by the palace that had manufactured him as emperor and witnessed his long, exhausting performance of that role. Contemporary accounts describe the final days. Franz Joseph continued working almost until the end, reviewing documents from his bed, signing decrees, maintaining the bureaucratic discipline that had structured his entire life. Attendants noted that he asked repeatedly about affairs of state, about military positions on the Eastern Front, about administrative matters that would have been trivial to a man hours from death, but that had defined his identity for nearly 7 decades. He could not stop being emperor. The role had merged so completely with his person that separation was impossible even in extremity. The palace responded to his death with rituals refined over centuries. Windows were draped in black cloth, clocks were stopped at the moment of death. Mirrors in the staterooms were covered. The great gallery, where Franz Joseph had attended countless ceremonies, was closed and would remain closed through the period of mourning. The chandeliers hung dark and silent above empty parquet floors. In Vienna, church bells tolled. Newspaper extras announced the death in sober language. His Majesty Emperor Franz Joseph has passed away. Court officials began arranging the funeral, a procession that would carry the emperor's body from Schönbrunn to the Capuchin crypt in Vienna's city center, where Habsburg rulers had been entombed since the 17th century. The route would pass through streets the emperor had traveled countless times, past buildings that had witnessed his reign, through a capital that had changed radically during his decades on the throne, but that still recognized him as a symbol of continuity, however obsolete. At Schönbrunn, the physical presence of death occupied specific rooms. The emperor's body lay in state in the apartment's main chamber, surrounded by candles, visited by family members and senior courtiers who came to pay respects. The room's furnishings, simple, almost austere by comparison with the palace's staterooms, revealed the man's personal preferences. Franz Joseph had lived surrounded by Baroque magnificence, but had chosen private simplicity, perhaps the only form of autonomy available to someone whose entire existence had been public. His successor, Archduke Charles, became Emperor Charles III. But the succession offered no reassurance. World War I was in its 3rd year. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was fracturing under military defeats and internal nationalist uprisings. Charles would reign for just 2 more years before the empire collapsed entirely. Franz Joseph's death marked not merely the end of a life, but the beginning of the end of the world his life had represented. For Schönbrunn, the emperor's death transformed the palace's symbolic meaning. It had been built as a nursery for dynasties, a machine for reproducing Habsburg power across generations. It had raised Franz Joseph from infancy, trained him in its corridors, observed his childhood drills in its gardens, and provided the stage for his adult reign. Now it had witnessed his death. The closed loop, birth and death in the same rooms, was complete. But the loop enclosed only one life, not the perpetual continuity the palace had promised. In the weeks after Franz Joseph's death, courtiers walked Schönbrunn's corridors with a new awareness. They were moving through a palace that had outlived its function. The building endured, physically intact, aesthetically magnificent, but the purpose that had justified its construction, sustaining an eternal dynasty, no longer seemed credible. Habsburg continuity had always been an aspiration, not a fact, and now even the aspiration felt hollow. The Great Gallery remained closed for months. When it finally reopened, the chandeliers were lit again, but the atmosphere had changed. Where once they had symbolized enlightened absolutism, they now illuminated a space that felt like a mausoleum, beautiful, historically significant, but fundamentally disconnected from the present. Franz Joseph's death at Schönbrunn closed a narrative arc that had begun with his birth there in 1830. The palace had framed his entire existence, every stage of development, every assumption about power and duty, every routine that structured his days. He had been its most complete product, a man so thoroughly shaped by the building that his identity was inseparable from its architectural logic. But that completeness was also a limitation. Franz Joseph's inability to adapt to changing political realities, his resistance to constitutional reform, his rigid adherence to outdated protocols, all these traits reflected the inflexibility inscribed in him during his Schönbrunn childhood. The palace had manufactured an emperor perfectly suited to the world of 1848, but unable to navigate the world of 1916. And when that emperor died, the palace stood as a monument not to continuity, but to obsolescence. Within 2 years, the empire would be gone. The nursery that had manufactured emperors would become property of a republic, its rooms repurposed, its gardens open to a public that had once been excluded. But on that November day in 1916, as Franz Joseph's body lay in state and the chandeliers remained dark, the palace held a silence that spoke to the fragility of all human ambitions to build against time. The stone had endured, the dynasty had not. In November 1918, Emperor Charles IV signed a proclamation recognizing Austria's right to determine its own form of government. The gesture, carefully worded to avoid explicit abdication, marked the de facto end of the Habsburg monarchy. Within days, the Austrian Republic was proclaimed. Imperial properties, including Schönbrunn, passed to state ownership. For the palace, the transition was less rupture than gradual transformation. In 1919, the Republican government declared Schönbrunn a public museum. Rooms that had been closed to all but court members were now open to ordinary Viennese citizens. Tickets were sold, guided tours began. The Great Gallery, where Maria Theresa had hosted balls and Franz Joseph had attended receptions, became a space for curious visitors to walk through and photograph. The change was profound but initially subtle. The rooms still looked imperial. Portraits of emperors and empresses remained on walls. Gilded furniture stood in formal arrangements. The chandeliers still hung from the same ceiling fixtures. But the context had shifted. Where once these spaces had functioned as stages for living power, they now served as exhibits of historical memory. The palace had become a museum of itself. The 1920s and 1930s brought financial challenges. The Austrian Republic, struggling with post-war inflation and economic instability, lacked funds for comprehensive restoration. Maintenance was deferred, leaks went unrepaired, paint faded. Photographs from the period show water stains on ceilings, worn parquet floors, and gardens less meticulously maintained than in imperial times. Schönbrunn endured, but it was visibly aging, its surfaces recording the decades of reduced care. In 1938, Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany. The palace served as a backdrop for propaganda events, its Baroque grandeur appropriated to lend historical legitimacy to the new regime. Photographs show Nazi banners hanging from the façade, swastikas juxtaposed with Rococo architecture in jarring visual contradiction. The palace that had manufactured Habsburg emperors now provided scenery for an ideology that despised dynastic traditions but coveted their symbolic power. World War II brought more direct damage. In 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Vienna, American bombers struck targets across the city. Schönbrunn, though not a primary target, was hit by bombs that damaged portions of the West Wing, destroying windows, collapsing part of a roof, and leaving craters in the gardens. Photographs from the immediate post-war period show broken glass, scaffolding, and workers clearing rubble. The palace that had survived 3 centuries of dynastic politics had been wounded by modern warfare in a matter of seconds. After Germany's surrender, Vienna was divided into 4 occupation zones, controlled by American, British, French, and Soviet forces. Schönbrunn fell within the British sector. The palace became headquarters for the British military delegation. its staterooms converted into offices, its corridors filled with soldiers, filing cabinets, typewriters, and the bureaucratic apparatus of occupation administration. Photographs from this period show surreal juxtapositions: military personnel walking through the Great Gallery in fatigues, desks and telephone cables cluttering rooms designed for ceremonial processions, and the chandeliers, still functioning, still glowing, casting light on a bas-relief world utterly alien to the one for which they had been designed. The fixtures that had once illuminated imperial balls now lit meetings about post-war governance, refugee resettlement, and denazification policies. The British occupation lasted a decade. During those years, Schönbrunn existed in a strange liminal state, still recognizably a palace, still containing its historical furnishings and artworks, but functioning as an office building for a foreign military. Conservators from Vienna's museums periodically inspected the rooms, documenting damage and advocating for restoration, but resources were scarce and the palace's fate uncertain. In 1955, Austria regained independence and the British withdrew. Schönbrunn returned fully to Austrian control, and the government committed to comprehensive restoration. Over the next 2 decades, conservators worked room by room, repairing bomb damage, replacing lost plasterwork, cleaning frescoes darkened by decades of grime, and restoring gardens to approximations of their 18th century layouts. The work was meticulous. Conservators consulted original floor plans, analyzed paint samples to determine historical color schemes, and sourced period-appropriate materials for repairs. The goal was not to modernize, but to recover, to make Schönbrunn look, as much as possible, as it had under Maria Theresa and Franz Joseph. This approach reflected a broader post-war cultural turn. Austria, grappling with its recent past and its ambiguous relationship to both Habsburg and Nazi histories, embraced imperial heritage as a form of symbolic continuity that predated fascism and offered an alternative narrative of national identity. Visitors increased steadily through the 1960s and 1970s. What had been a modest museum in the interwar years became a major tourist attraction. Viennese families, European tourists, and international visitors came to see the palace, walking through rooms where emperors had lived, dining in the gardens where archdukes had drilled. Schönbrunn's transformation from residence to museum was now complete. But the transformation came with ironies. The palace that had been designed to manufacture emperors and sustain dynastic continuity now manufactured memories and sustained a heritage industry. The Great Gallery hosted concerts and state receptions for the Austrian government, performances of republicanism in spaces built for monarchy. The chandeliers still glowed, but they illuminated tourists photographing themselves, children running across parquet floors, and guides explaining history to groups who had no personal connection to the empire the palace once served. In the decades after the monarchy fell and the empire dissolved, Schönbrunn ceased being a machine for power and became an archive of what power had once looked like. The rooms preserved the image of imperial life, but the substance had evaporated. What remained was surface, beautiful, meticulously maintained, and profoundly empty of the purposes that had called it into being. In 1996, UNESCO inscribed Schönbrunn Palace and Gardens on its World Heritage List, recognizing the site as one of the most impressive and well-preserved Baroque ensembles of its kind in Europe, and as a material expression of Habsburg power from the 17th through early 20th centuries. The designation formalized what had been implicit for decades. Schönbrunn was no longer an active residence or governmental center, but a monument of universal historical value, worthy of preservation and study. The UNESCO nomination dossier, a detailed document prepared by Austrian heritage officials, described the palace's architectural significance, its landscape design, and its role in European cultural history. It emphasized integrity. The palace had retained its original layout and most of its furnishings, and authenticity. Restorations had followed documentary evidence rather than imposing anachronistic interpretations. The dossier made clear that Schönbrunn's value lay not merely in beauty, but in its capacity to convey historical processes. The the rise and fall of dynasties, the ideology of absolutism, the relationship between architecture and power. Management of the site had been formalized in 1992 with the creation of Schloss Schönbrunn Kultur- und Betriebsgesellschaft GmbH, a state-owned limited company responsible for operating the palace as a cultural institution. Funding came primarily from tourism revenues rather than direct government subsidies, a model that turned Schönbrunn into a self-sustaining heritage enterprise. Ticket sales, cafe and gift shop revenues, and rental fees for events in the Great Gallery covered both operating costs and ongoing restoration projects. This financial model brought benefits and tensions. On one hand, it incentivized excellence. The better the visitor experience, the more revenue, the more funding available for conservation. On the other hand, it pressured managers to maximize visitor numbers, sometimes at the expense of preservation goals. Wear on parquet floors, humidity changes from crowded rooms, and the logistics of moving tens of thousands of visitors annually through fragile historical spaces created conservation challenges. By the early 21st century, Schönbrunn was attracting over 3 million visitors per year, making it one of Austria's most visited cultural sites. Conservators responded with careful monitoring. Humidity sensors tracked environmental conditions in staterooms. Floors were periodically refinished, textiles were rotated to minimize light damage, and certain rooms were closed to the public, accessible only through virtual tours or limited guided visits. The chandeliers required specialized attention. In 2008, conservators undertook a comprehensive restoration of the Great Gallery's fixtures, removing each chandelier for cleaning, repairing broken crystal elements, and rewiring the electrical systems with modern, low-heat LED bulbs designed to mimic the color temperature of candlelight. The work took months. During restoration, photographs documented every stage, creating archival records for future conservators. The restored chandeliers, when rehung, looked both historical and subtly contemporary. To the casual observer, they appeared identical to the 18th century originals. But close inspection revealed the LED bulbs, the reinforced mounting brackets, the modern wiring hidden within gilded frames, layers of intervention that acknowledged the impossibility of pure preservation. Every act of conservation was also an act of transformation, adapting historical objects for present-day contexts and future survival. These interventions sparked debates among heritage professionals. Some argued for radical transparency, making all modern modifications visible, refusing to create illusions of untouched authenticity. Others defended the current approach, historical appearance preserved through invisible modern means, allowing visitors to experience the palace's aesthetic without confronting technical infrastructure. The debate reflected larger questions about what heritage sites should communicate. Is Schönbrunn most valuable as a document of Baroque architecture to be preserved in period-accurate form, or as a site for critical reflection on power, inequality, and the costs of dynastic ambition, or as a beautiful space where visitors experience aesthetic pleasure without necessarily engaging historical complexity? Different constituencies answered differently. Tourists often sought beauty and spectacle, photographing chandeliers and mirrors without deep interest in the Habsburg system that produced them. School groups received guided tours emphasizing historical facts, construction dates, architectural styles, the names and deeds of emperors. Scholars approached the site as primary evidence, analyzing spatial organization, decorative programs, and material culture, to understand how architecture shaped and reflected social relations. Schloss Schönbrunn, Kultur- und Betriebsgesellschaft GmbH, attempted to serve all audiences, producing interpretive materials at multiple levels, simple labels for casual visitors, detailed guidebooks for serious tourists, and scholarly catalogs for researchers. But the inherent tensions remained. A palace designed to glorify monarchy now operated under democratic principles of public access and educational mission. The building that had excluded ordinary people now welcomed them, but on terms shaped by contemporary cultural industries, heritage tourism, and the economic necessity of self-funding. The chandeliers, glowing steadily under LED lighting, symbolized these contradictions. They were historical objects and modern reconstructions, authentic and adapted, beautiful remnants of an oppressive system now repurposed for public education and aesthetic enjoyment. They hung above a gallery where emperors no longer walked, where tourists photographed themselves against gilded mirrors, and where evening concerts performed Mozart and Strauss for audiences who paid admission rather than receiving court invitations. Schönbrunn had survived by becoming something other than itself. The palace endured not as an active center of power, but as a curated memory, a carefully maintained stage where the past was performed for present-day audiences who could visit, learn, photograph, and leave, free from the obligations and constraints that had shaped the lives of those who once lived within its walls. In 2002, Schönbrunn opened the Kindermuseum, Children's Museum, in the West Tract, building on earlier educational programs begun in the 1990s. The museum occupies rooms that once served as apartments and service spaces, now transformed into interactive exhibits designed to teach children about imperial court life through hands-on experience. Visitors, mostly families with children aged 5 to 12, enter a series of rooms outfitted with period costumes, replica furniture, and activity stations. Children can dress in miniature versions of court clothing, boys in military uniforms with brass buttons, girls in empire waist dresses with silk sashes. They learn to bow and curtsy, practice formal greetings, and sit at a table set with porcelain to understand court dining etiquette. Interpretive labels, written in child-friendly language, explain how imperial children lived, when they woke, what they ate, how often they bathed, how their hair was styled, and how their daily routines differed from those of contemporary middle-class families. One exhibit recreates a schoolroom with desks, slates, and instructional materials modeled on 19th-century examples. Children sit at the desks, hold period writing implements, and attempt lessons in penmanship or arithmetic under the guidance of museum educators playing the role of tutors. The experience aims to convey both the privilege and the constraints of imperial childhood, access to education and material comfort, but also relentless discipline and surveillance. Another section focuses on play. Display cases show historical toys, porcelain dolls, wooden soldiers, miniature carriages, alongside explanations of how imperial children's play was structured and supervised. Interactive stations allow modern children to play with replica toys, but interpretive text emphasizes that Habsburg children's recreation was never truly free. Even games served pedagogical purposes, teaching hierarchy, obedience, and the performance of social roles. The museum's approach is simultaneously celebratory and critical. It invites children to imagine themselves as princes and princesses, experiencing the glamour of court life while also explaining the rigidity and psychological costs of such upbringing. Wall texts note that imperial children rarely saw their parents except during scheduled appointments, that they were punished for protocol violations, and that their futures were determined by dynastic needs rather than personal preference. The final room addresses the end of the monarchy and the transformation of the palace into a public museum. A timeline explains the events of 1918, the proclamation of the Republic, and the decision to open Schönbrunn to all citizens. Children are invited to reflect on the difference between living in a palace as an imperial child, beautiful surroundings but restricted freedom, and visiting a palace as a modern tourist, temporary access but personal autonomy. The Kindermuseum represents a remarkable inversion. Rooms that once constrained children in service of dynastic continuity now welcome children for educational enrichment and entertainment. The palace that manufactured emperors now manufactures historical awareness, using the same spaces to teach about power, privilege, and the contingency of political systems. Where tutors once drilled obedience, museum educators now encourage questions. Where protocol once dictated movement, children now run freely between exhibits. Yet the inversion is not complete. The museum commodifies imperial childhood, packaging it as an experience to be consumed during a 2-hour visit. The glamour of dressing in costumes and role-playing court life risks overshadowing the critical content about inequality and constraint. Children leave with photographs of themselves in period dress, playful images that aestheticize a system built on subordination. Schönbrunn's transformation into an educational site has not erased its original purpose, but layered new meanings atop old ones. The palace remains a monument to Habsburg ambition, but it is also now a stage for democratic education, where children from all backgrounds can enter spaces once restricted to a tiny elite and learn about the histories those spaces contain. The nursery has survived by ceasing to manufacture emperors and beginning to manufacture citizens, informed, critical, aware of their own historical agency. One object, housed not at Schönbrunn but in Vienna's imperial treasury, encapsulates the extremity of dynastic ambition, the cradle of the King of Rome. Created in 1811 to celebrate the birth of Napoleon II, son of Napoleon Bonaparte and Empress Maria Louise of Austria, the cradle is an extravagant construction of silver gilt, mother of pearl, velvet, and allegory. Its design incorporates eagles, laurel wreaths, and classical motifs, asserting the child's destiny as heir to an empire. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The symbolism is overwhelming. Napoleon II never ruled. His father abdicated when the child was 3. The boy was brought to Vienna and raised at Schönbrunn under the title Duke of Reichstadt, a Habsburg archduke in all but name. He died at Schönbrunn in 1832, aged 21, of tuberculosis. The cradle that proclaimed his imperial destiny outlived him, a monument to ambitions thwarted by history. Today, it rests in a glass case, illuminated by museum lighting, admired by visitors for its artistry while serving as a cautionary emblem. Even the most lavishly crafted symbols of continuity cannot secure the futures they imagine. At Schönbrunn itself, the palace and gardens now host over 3 million visitors annually. The Meidlinger Vertiefung, where princes once drilled, is a cafe. The Wagenburg displays carriages behind glass. The Great Gallery hosts evening concerts of classical music, its chandeliers glowing above audiences who applaud and leave, the space serving beauty and culture, but no longer power. Tourists photograph themselves where archdukes learned to bow, where emperors walked from nursery to throne room, where the machinery of dynasty hummed for centuries. The chandeliers remain, restored, rewired, shining under LED bulbs that mimic candlelight. They hang as they have since the 18th century, casting light across mirrors and parquet. They have witnessed transformations, from candlelit symbol of enlightened absolutism to electric-lit fixture of a dying empire, to museum object, to stage lighting for concerts and state receptions of a republic. They endure, beautiful and emptied of their original meaning, glowing over a space that has outlived its purpose. Schönbrunn was built to hold a dynasty above time, to turn children into emperors and stone into permanence. Today, it holds only echoes of footsteps on parquet, of carriages on gravel, of lullabies sung in languages of empire. The palace endures, but the world it was meant to secure survives only in photographs, inventories, and guided tours. In the end, the nursery that manufactured emperors became another archive, a reminder that every monument to immortality is, in time, reduced to memory.